You cannot drive your EV fast enough or far enough. You cannot compost enough. You cannot pull enough swirly bulbs in your house to combat the climate crisis. It's going to take us collectively as a culture and society working together to face down this problem.
Welcome to Ecophonia. If saving the planet sounds a little bit daunting, it is. I feel that way too, so I'm talking to experts across industries and across the country to get to the root of how change is really made, in order to help you learn ways to make the world a better place. I'm here to investigate what really makes the biggest impact, and to connect you with real people who already have their feet on the ground. This is part 2 of my conversation with Marqus Cole, Organizing Director at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, also known as GIPL. If you haven't listened to or watched part 1 of this conversation, I highly recommend you do so, as we reference many things in this episode that were covered in part 1. The link will be in the description. In this episode, we dive into advocacy both at the local and federal level, the relationship between faith and climate change, and what the secular and faith worlds can learn from each other. This episode opened my mind, and Marqus has a lot of nuggets that I hope you guys all learn from. To kick off this episode, I asked Marqus about how they do advocacy at the federal level.
We talked about Summer of Advocacy. So the inaugural Summer of Advocacy last summer in 2024 was focused on federal work. And so why do I bring that up? In the summer of 2024, during the last administration, one of the things that was really critical for our state of Georgia was the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And as many of your listeners may well know, the 49th and 50th vote for both of those bills came from the great state of Georgia, Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock. So just noting that historic climate change action in federal dollars flowed forward from Georgians deciding to elect Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff 4 and 6 years ago apiece. That's critical to know. Because Georgians said, this is what we want, and this is how we're going to do it and how we're going to vote, we got those 2 votes that allowed for these historic passages of bills. Why do I tell you that? Because last summer, what we did as part of our Summer of Advocacy was an entire campaign around protecting historic climate investment. We wanted to let our federal delegation of policymakers know that it was important to people of faith in Georgia that those dollars that were coming into Georgia, offering real good jobs, offering renewable energy, offering appliances that are more efficient, those are worth protecting and saving. And so one of the key events we had at the end of that summer in July was a visibility event at Senator Ossoff's office. We had multiple people, about a dozen folks, down at his office on the street with our Summer of Advocacy signs, waving and cheering on people that came by and raising awareness about our Summer of Advocacy and what we were doing. At the end of that, a couple of the folks that were with us got a chance to meet with the staffer from Senator Ossoff's office to express why they were so excited to be there, why they wanted to thank Senator Ossoff for his vote, but also make the specific ask that he continue to defend that funding at the federal level because it was doing such great work in Georgia. For some of these folks, it was their first time ever doing a visibility event or anything like that. And they were so surprised how much access we had to a sitting senator. And one of the things I like to tell people all the time is they work for us. You don't work for them. And so GIPL has the type of relationships with our federal delegation that we can go sit and talk to a Representative Buddy Carter in Savannah, which I got a chance to do with our coastal organizer, go down to Representative Carter's office and meet with the staff to say, here's who we are, here's what we do. This is how many people of faith in Georgia care about this. And oh, by the way, we know that you have that big Hyundai plant coming down here to the coast. We want to make sure that that Hyundai plant that's rolling out these EVs has the funds it needs and the support it needs federally to keep doing that work and employing people. So at the federal level, a lot of time it looks like connecting the people in our GIPL community to the policymakers that otherwise wouldn't hear from them, or the people that otherwise think they can't reach federal policymakers. So I actually love the federal work we do, even in challenging times like we're currently in right now.
For reference, for our listeners, those 2 big federal acts that you mentioned, the bipartisan one and then the Inflation Reduction Act, can you just give me a brief rundown of what those are and why they're important?
Yeah, so both bills do a lot of different things, and it could be a whole podcast. And I'm sure there are lots of podcasts you could go listen to that breaks down the bills in more detail. What I will say for practical climate solutions, and this is what's really important here, and people don't think about this, most churches or houses of worship are 501c3s. They're not-for-profits by definition. And for so long, getting solar or batteries has been so expensive. These bills did two things. One, it offered rebates and the opportunity to reduce the cost of solar and batteries and energy efficiency things. We talked about Drawdown Georgia. But for the first time ever, houses of worship were able to get, well, you and I as individual citizens can get tax rebates when we get appliances, because we pay taxes. But houses of worship don't pay taxes. So for so long, they were locked out of those carrots that incentivize people to get solar. Those bills changed that with direct pay. And it's been a game changer. We've talked to lots of communities and churches that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford solar, but now can because of direct pay. That has been huge. We also talked about things like sending federal dollars down to states to do work. Georgia's benefited from that, whether it be the Hyundai plant that I mentioned. I referenced earlier Q-Cells, which is bringing solar manufacturing here. We have a lot of batteries that are happening here in the state of Georgia now. So many critical dollars, planting trees to help with shade in urban areas, to reduce the amount of energy needed to power in these hot summer Georgias. So many examples could come out of this. But what I would just like to say is those policies didn't come out of nowhere. People wanted those policies, and we had the political willpower to do it because of how Georgians voted. And I don't mean that in a partisan way, like they voted for Team Blue instead of Team Red or Team Red instead of Team Blue. What I'm saying is that at the forefront of who they were voting for and why they were voting for them, climate and clean energy is one of the things we're hearing about from Georgia.
That's huge. So I guess talked about federal and then state. What have you guys done at the local level?
Yeah, local is actually, and you use the word hyper-local, so I'll use it as well. It's one of the more critical areas that we're involved in. And in fact, I'll give you a really great example down in Adel, Georgia, which most of your folks will never know of or never visit and have to, Adel, A-D-E-L, Google it. One of the issues, the environmental justice issues we're fighting on down there is biomass. What is biomass? I've never heard of biomass. Those little wood pellets, right? And so one of the things that's happened in Europe as they have tried to move off of fossil fuels, especially being dependent on Russia, is many folks in the European market burn biomass to heat and fuel things. Georgia has a huge timber community. What that means is in Georgia, oftentimes we are cutting down trees here that sequester carbon, he adds, in an industry-heavy kind of process that pollutes the air here in these rural areas to turn into these wood chips or wood pellets that we then send across the ocean, usually on fossil fuel burning ships, that they can then burn and combust as energy. This has a lot of problems in this ecosystem. I want to assure your listeners, biomass, depending on how you define it and what you're talking about, we could also talk about corn ethanol. I won't, but we could. Biomass has challenges, but one of the specific hyperlocal challenges is that in the communities where that industry has taken place and where they're not going to be burning that biomass, even if the biomass was good, it pollutes the air and water there in those communities to then send that energy off to another community. That's an EJ issue. That's asking a community to bear the cost, the external cost, to say nothing of the actual cost of those facilities, in cancer, in heavy metals in the air, and polluted water, so that others can have a fuel source that they think is cleaner. That's an EJ issue, and that's a hyperlocal EJ issue.
So I guess you guys would work or have a call to action for that community to sort of fight, biomass or...
Yeah, that's exactly. We've been working with congregations, many of them down there, equipping them, to go back to our mission, inspire and equipping them to talk to local policymakers, whether that be county commissioners that have the power to do zoning about whether or not these plants are going to come or not. But I talked earlier about that multiplication funnel and folks not serving our needs. One of the key critical things we do is our PowerWise program down there. We just had 3 congregations walk through the PowerWise energy audit with us, and soon they're going to be getting their energy audit report of things that they can do. So separate from biomass, before we ever talk about a wood pellet, we talk about how can we help your congregation? How can we serve your congregation? We did a GOTV effort, Get Out the Vote effort, last year in 2024, where we had folks work alongside us to send text messages out to their community to say, here's the election day, here's how you get registered to vote, here's how you go vote. Not partisan, just giving information. And as part of that, we did micro grants to these communities saying, hey, we want to give you $500 or $1,000 to come learn alongside us how to send these text messages, and you go do a program or a project that's important with you with this seed money. Again, building that trust and relationship. We want them to not just do the one-off biomass thing with us. We want to teach them how to send text messages, not because our text messages are important to us, but for issues that are important to them. We want to make sure that they have the resources to know how to receive grants. $500 or $1,000 might not seem like a lot to the folks listening to this podcast, but knowing how to do a grant application and receive those funds so that you can then apply for bigger and bigger grants, well, that is critical. That's critical infrastructure. And we're coming alongside congregations that they usually pass the hat when they want to get more money and resources. We're teaching them how to get those resources. We're equipping them so that they can do it on their own long past the time when GIPL was there. We want to help folks be self-sufficient. And that's a critical part of it, so that, yes, we're helping them fight biomass, but biomass is just the flavor of the month, the flavor of the year. There will be more EJ issues. And if we're not training people how to be leaders in their community, well, then we're just building up followers. And that's not really what we're here for.
And it also kind of comes back to like personalizing your message when you're talking to, well, your friends, or maybe it's the board, and it's the commissioners. And it's like, you guys can't tell them what to do. You have to have them, let them go out.
It's critical. And that hyperlocal nature is important. Last year, we did a regional summit on the coast where we had over 80 people join us in Savannah. So not the metro Atlanta area where, all the people that care about environmentalism live in the city. No. We're talking down on the coast. And we had issues that were important to them. This was right before Hurricane Helene, unfortunately. So, talking about climate resilient or climate crisis, extreme storms, and the need to be resilient. This isn't a future issue anymore. This is a right now issue. And so how can we make our communities more resilient with solar battery storage so that when those storms come, the church, the masjid, the synagogue, the community center will have power when the power lines are down. Folks can put their insulin medicine in the refrigerators that are on. Folks can charge their phones so that they can get to call their loved ones. It's those types of opportunities, much more than talking to policymakers, that I think are going to make the real difference when that next superstorm hits. But because of the solar power and the batteries, folks will have their own stories. It won't be GIPL's story, it'll be their story about the importance and value of renewables. And then when that IRP comes back in 3 years, because they've been trained on how to give public comment, they can say, when that superstorm hit, my community of faith was resilient and able to help people. And we did it with a few $1,000s. Georgia Power with its billions should be doing better. That's the testimony, right? Like, that's how this circle works. The practical climate solutions power the stories that power the advocacy and raise awareness so that we can get more resources to do the practical climate solutions. And that hyper-local nature brings about the best stories.
Moving a little bit more generally, do you have some stories of specific GIPL initiatives that have led to a very tangible positive impact in the community? I know we've covered a lot of ground already, but is there something that you haven't talked about that you'd love to talk about?
Yeah, we talked about the iftar, zero waste dinners, and the amount of food that was diverted there. We talked generally about the PowerWise program and SolarWise. I want to give you two congregations because it's important. Just this week, we were able to announce in partnership with North Decatur UMC, they are recipients of a SolarWise program. What does that mean? They're going to get 56 kilowatt solar system, solar power. That might not mean anything to your listeners. This will. 77% of their annual energy will be offset by solar panels. 77%. 3/4. How many more math ways can I say this? It's incredible. 3/4 of the amount of energy that they need. And I talked about this earlier. What do we have? What do we need? So they knew their energy need, and now they're going to have a system that reduces that need to draw on the grid by 77%. That's an incredible story of how the SolarWise program works. I want to tell you about our friends at Jubilee who are 2025 PowerWise grant recipients. They were able to put in a heat pump system, a solar installation, and plant gardens and orchards, right? So fruiting trees that will produce product and benefits for the community, a solar installation that will reduce their energy usage, and a heat pump system that will reduce the amount of need on site. These are like super local, real, tangible examples of how these communities will go in a different direction now because of the work that they get to do with GIPL. I talked about the students coming to give public commentary and their voices echoing across the internet and newspapers around the world because of a 2-hour training in a library. Like these incredible stories. I'll tell you another just real quick. We had that summit on the coast in Savannah last year I mentioned. 3 of our kind of panelists that were there with us, folks from the community that do some of this work with us, the BBC was there with us at Summit. They were interviewed and made part of a podcast series that ran globally. 3 local people of faith from Georgia had their message shared globally. That's incredible when you think about it. GIPL, this little nonprofit here, housed out of Columbia Theological Seminary, just in this little office doing great work that we can do with the 9 of us. We're not as big as Georgia Power. We're not as resourced as Georgia Power. But 13 students came and spoke truth to power to Georgia Power. That's incredible when you really think about it. And it's an incredible testament to the success of our advocates and the folks we get to work with.
It is incredible. I guess on the converse of that, what are some of the biggest challenges that you guys have run into?
Yeah, Georgia Interfaith Power and Light is a long name, so that's a challenge for folks to remember. So you're Georgia Power? No, I'm not Georgia Power. I'm Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. I kid and joke. Part of it, though, is it's very rare over the past 30 years that you hear words faith and power put together, or climate and communities of faith put together. And that actually makes me a little sad, Anna, because for so long, it was people of faith, no matter their religious tradition, that were caring for the earth. Like part of their identity was to be good stewards. Again, we could have this conversation about what happened in the 60s and 70s politically that cleaved that identity and made some folks of faith believe, I think erroneously, that they couldn't care about our shared sacred home and have some of the other values that were important to them, that they had to self-sort into these political parties, such that if you're a person like me that's a person of faith that follows Jesus, sometimes I'll have this kind of moment where I tell people what I do. And if they know me as a follower of Jesus, they're like, wait, you do environmentalism stuff and you're a Christian? Like, how does that work? Or folks that know me in my environmentalist work that I do, organizing director, and I'll be like, yeah, I went to church this Sunday. And I'm like, wait, you care about the earth and you go to church? This does not compute. And so quite a bit of my work actually is helping reintegrate and bring a more holistic view for folks that I don't check my identity as a person of faith at the door when I do policy work. And in fact, the policy work I do is fueled by what I believe is a scriptural mandate to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with the Lord my God. And so that is a challenge doing the work that we do because it disrupts what people think of as a person that cares for the environment. So that's the first big challenge. Another challenge that's related to that, there's a lot of work to do. We've talked about federal work, we've talked about state, we've talked about local. You'll hear people talk about burnout or eco-grief. Many of your listeners will know that term, eco-grief. It's hard and it's real. We haven't acted aggressively enough, fast enough as a society to combat the harms we've done to the planet. And real people are suffering. More people will suffer. That causes grief. It does. And it's going to be hard to adapt and it's going to be hard to mitigate. And if we can't have those hard conversations, Anna, then the people like your listeners who care about this will continue to grieve. And one of the things that GIPL is really focused on is ensuring that those people connect and see each other, especially when they're in faith communities that oftentimes they're the only person in their congregation that cares, or they think they're the only one in their congregation that cares. And we want to connect them so that they're not an island and so that they can take that grief and turn it into lament. And that lament into, and I know it's a churchy word, but I'm going to use it, repent, which is simply turning back and going a different way than they came in. We're going to do differently because in our being, we're different. That's a challenge, getting people to move from grief to lament to repentance and doing something new and different. And I think between those two, the identity politics of the day, the fear of dealing with our eco-grief because of what it'll mean, it will mean we will have to do things differently. We may have to support things that we otherwise didn't want to support. I think both of those are challenges for people of faith in Georgia.
I do want to dive more into that first part specifically. So I guess what happened in the 60s, 70s that caused this divide, if you want to get into it?
Yeah, I'd love to get into it. And I think history is important. History is prelude to present. And so it might strike some of your viewers and listeners as surprising to hear that the EPA itself came into existence under a Republican president. This is a true fact that people can go look up for themselves. It's also the case that until about the 60s and 70s, people of faith, specifically Christians in the United States, were supportive of environmental policies. In fact, the conservation movement, including national parks, came from, relatively speaking, conservative presidents, right? Whether that be Teddy Roosevelt or others. And so the idea that folks wanted to conserve the natural beauty of the Americas was a very live and real story that we told until about the 60s and 70s. And there are folks, and you can go read books, Jesus and John Wayne, The Nature of the Religious Right. There are a bunch of books I could offer to people. I just named two of them that I think are helpful with this time period. But what we found is, well, something key and critical happened in 64 and 65, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. At the same time as the feminist movement was finding its newest self in life during that 60s and 70s time, the countercultural movement was happening, and the environmental movement in that first Earth Day that happened 50 years ago now at this point was all happening in this nexus of the late 60s and the early 70s. And a political calculation was made, I would suggest to your viewers, by one party to capitalize on this countercultural movement and the backlash that they thought that they would ensue with that, right? that if there are folks that want to conserve the way of living in power structures they need to vote this certain way against all those other people that are throwing out the old ways, right? Look at them. Those people, whoever those people are in this telling of the story that happened with the realignment in the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy is something your viewers can go look up and see. But what happened after the 60s and 70s was that we got a political realignment into the 80s. And also in the 80s, we got a philosophy of both trickle down, which many of your folks will be familiar with, policies, but also shrinking the size of government. Now, whatever your viewers and your listeners think of the efficiency of government and government-run programs and policies, what I will say is that the climate crisis we face today is a collective action problem. You cannot drive your EV fast enough or far enough. You cannot compost enough. You cannot pull enough swirly bulbs in your house to combat the climate crisis. No single one of us individually can do it. It's going to take us collectively as a culture and society, internationally, working together to face down this problem. We just spent 40 years in a storyline of rugged individualism, of capitalism can do it, and that we don't need collective solutions to problems. We need people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That's the story our culture has been inhabiting for about 40 years now. That story will not give us enough political or policy room to work together to take the type of collective action we need to get to the other side of this century.
So how do you fight a story that's been being told for 40 years?
With a story that's been told for 4,000 years. And this is what we get from our Jewish brothers and sisters, right? Planting a tree. I've heard from Muslim brothers and sisters in these contexts that this story, they say that their scripture, this value that if the day of judgment is at hand and you have a tree in your hand, you should plant that tree anyway. There's this deeper story than capitalism. And I don't mean for this conversation to take an anti-capitalism bit. I just want to compare two stories. One story says resources are scarce. The more scarce they are, the more valuable they become. The more valuable they are, the more we have to hoard and hold on to. And there's another story that says life is abundant. There is enough for everyone if we take the share that we need, and that through reciprocity with one another and with the earth itself, we can sustain. It's not just that those stories are in conflict. It's that the materialistic, capitalistic story has to undermine the deeper story that faith traditions hold on to. Because if faith traditions were to truly live out an abundance story, a reciprocity story, a caring and loving your neighbor story, then it would have to call on capitalism to stop harming people, stop polluting the air, stop polluting water, stop ripping up communities and mountains to harvest coal and pollute the water with coal ash. When there's sunlight and wind and geothermal energy that can power. We don't have to take, we can receive. But one story relies on taking, and one story relies on receiving. And so we tell the story of receiving over and over again. That's how we win.
You had mentioned this example when you go to perhaps some of your climate environmental friends. They're like, what, you're a person of faith? And you go to your faith friends and they're like, what, you're an environmentalist?
Yeah.
What can those two groups learn from each other? And how do you think we could start bridging that gap so that's not so weird? Because obviously, I mean, we all have this common interest and we're, you know, people of faith are called to take care of the earth, but how do we better bridge it and what can they learn from each other?
Yeah, that's such a insightful question. And I've alluded to 2 points that I think the secular world can learn from the faith world. And one is a longer timeline. If your timeline is the next earnings report or your quarterly report or your profit margin loss at the end of an annual year, then in some ways, again, I made this point about Georgia Power, it's not irrational to do what they're doing. Tearing into the earth, drilling deep and ripping out resources that you then sell for profit, that people burn and only use one time, so then they come back to you to buy more of it and you have to rip out more of it from the earth. It makes a certain type of dark sense to do that if your timeline is the next profit margin loss earnings. But people of faith tend to look over generations, some of us even to a life after. And that story of immediate gain and profit at the expense of the next generation or the second and third generation, it does not make sense. In fact, it's unjust. Leaving the earth worse off for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren so that a small minority of folks can get rich now, even saying it out loud as you're listening to this here in the room with me and your listeners are listening to it, you know that doesn't make sense. Of course it doesn't make sense. But if we're not looking at a horizon that's over a profit margin, if we're not looking generationally, then who cares? So that's the first thing that the secular world can learn from the faith community is these longer horizons. There's also, maybe counterintuitively for folks listening that aren't people of faith, faith communities do know how to take collective action. They take collective action to build their houses of worship. They take collective action to care for those in need, whether it be soup kitchens or benevolence offerings. They take care of the sick and the shut-in in their own communities. There is something, we call it sacrifice in communities of faith, that people of faith are willing to do for their values when they believe they're called to do it. I've alluded to this already. The climate crisis is a collective action process. We are going to have to do things differently for a higher value, caring for a shared sacred home. Now, I don't usually talk about it as sacrifice when I'm out there in the world because folks don't want to sacrifice their Big Mac or their truck. I get it. But what we can call people to is loving their neighbor, caring for one another. And that might require doing things differently or using different energy sources to power that truck or to get that burger. And so those are things that the faith community can teach the secular world in an important way. Now, it is a two-way street. Scientists agree about what's happening. The experts agree, and the facts and figures are in. Since the Industrial Revolution and our burning of fossil fuels, we have been heating up our planet. Historically, that's been with carbon. Now it's with methane. And while I appreciate a generation ago politically, folks talking about methane as a bridge fuel to renewables, we've been on this bridge for a very long time. And in fact, as some of your viewers may know, methane packs a punch 20 times that of carbon immediately when it's burned, to say nothing of the burn-offs that happen on site at methane. So methane, while I, Marqus, organizing director for GIPL, would not call a cleaner source than carbon for lots of reasons, what I will say is, even if you believe in your heart of hearts that methane is a bridge fuel to get us off of dirty fossil fuels like coal and oil, if we don't have an end goal in mind with renewables plus storage, we're not going to give up the narcotic of methane. And so we need faith communities to know when you turn that microphone on or those lights on for your house of worship, what's powering that? And what's powering it right now here in Georgia are dirty fossil fuels that are impacting all of our bills in the summer and in the winter. It's polluting our air and it's making our earth more uninhabitable for us and the more than human creation. We need people of faith to know that the science is in, the experts agree, it's real, it's bad, and it's us. And I actually love those 10 words that I got from my friends at the Yale program on climate change communication. I was a Public Voices fellow there, and they told us there are 10 words you should always say. Here they go, audience. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, there's hope. So there's 5 kind of pairings of 2 words. It is real, the climate crisis is real. It is us, it is human related. It is bad, the experts agree, but there's hope. There is something that we can do. And I think those 10 words are important for communities of faith to hear as well.
How do you address sort of skepticism to that?
Yeah, skepticism is a real challenge in faith communities. Funny enough. I think one, and we kind of laughed at that for those that aren't watching with us. So communities of faith, by definition, have faith in things that are unseen. And so there is margin to have that conversation. But usually when we talk about skepticism in the American context, what we're actually talking about is an identity issue, that folks feel threatened, that when we talk about the climate crisis or environmental justice, what we're suggesting implicitly, and I think they get this from folks, especially environmentalists, is that what's being said is they're bad people in doing bad things and they're hurting people. And one, I don't think most folks think that about themselves. They don't think they're bad people. They don't think they're doing bad things, and they don't think they're hurting people. And I think facing the reality that some of the choices that we make, and I'm including myself in this, we're all impacted by this, we're all implicated in this, are bad for one another and the planet, that they do hurt one another and the planet. It's a hard truth to hear. And so instead of hearing that truth, what they want to do is make it a tribal issue, right? And so the skepticism I have found is more being skeptical of the messenger, not the message. And so the way that they defend themselves from the message is to attack the messenger. But it's the liberal tree huggers. It's the Bernie Sanders bros, right? Like that's who it is. I can't trust the message because the messenger. And so part of the work we do at GIPL is empowering trusted messengers to bring the message. That's the first step. But there's this other thing, and that's why I ended with there's hope. And I was trained as a Public Voices fellow and a GRIS 50 fixer to share that there's hope part, is because I actually think the secular world and some of my environmentalist friends sometimes end the story too soon. Things are bad. It's us. It's real. Well, that leaves people in a place of nihilism where there's nothing for me to do because I'm one person and I can't change. I can't make the Paris Climate Accords work. No, you can't. But you can be a witness. You can make sure your house of worship has a 77% reduction in the amount of energy it uses. And if all the houses of worship do that, Georgia Power doesn't need as much power. You can come speak to the Public Service Commission to convince them that what we need here in Georgia is renewables, not fossil fuels. You can 100% do that. I know it's possible because I just worked with 13 Emory students who don't have the time, talent, or resources that you do, listener, but they were able to do it. So I know you can do it. And so I think that that's part of the story that's important there. And then the last thing I'll say that the faith community can learn from the secular world, and this is important, is not just that the science is real, and we're talking about this skepticism and identity, but, and this is the most important thing that I do as a person of faith that works on climate things. I'm a person of faith that works on climate things. You can do it too. You don't have to give up your faith values to care about the earth. In fact, I think you should probably bring them with you. You don't have to give up your environmental values at the door on Friday night or Saturday or Sunday when you go to your house of worship. In fact, I would love it if you brought those values into the house of worship with you and talked to your lead person about it, because you're the best messenger in your house of worship. And I think when folks hear me talk or my colleagues talk and say, I didn't know I could be an evangelical Christian and someone that cares about the environment, when that happens, when that light turns on for them, that's the most important thing we do.
That's awesome. So, I mean, a big part of this is trust.
Yeah.
Do you try to build trust with people, or are you going to the people that trust other people who are interested in you, and then you teach the trusted people and the trusted people go out in your sort of multiplication funnel?
Yes. So many of the folks listening to this today will hear about the work that GIPL does because they trust you, Anna. And you came, we found each other and we had this conversation. What would it be like to have this podcast? So they trust you, and I am leveraging your trust that you have with your audience, that they are listening to this conversation, they are watching this, and that something I'm going to say is meaningful. And they trust that you've done your research, that, you know, as a producer, you vetted us and you kind of checked out, you've poked around. The questions you're asking aren't like shooting from the hip, but they have a real value. You're going to ask me challenging questions, and they trust you. And so I am coming through your medium and platform telling you, the viewer and listener, you can trust Anna. She's going to do a great job. In fact, you're listening to a great interview right now, and she's unearthing some really important things for people to hear. And if something that she's unearthed has been meaningful to you and you can take action, let's do it together. One route, right? I didn't find these people that are listening. You did, your audience, and they're coming. But there are, yes, some trusted folks that we have in the community, partners we work with. You talked about Drawdown Georgia. The Georgia Water Coalition makes up over 200 people or communities in Georgia that fight for water issues. There are folks here in the local, in the state level, at the federal level, partners that we work with, denominations that we work with of all types of faith traditions, that we have built trusting relationships such that when people come to them and say, hey, we're interested in doing this, who should we talk to? Do you know my friends GIPL? Do you know Marqus? You should talk to Marqus. That'd be great. In fact, those students that I talked to you about at Emory, a cold call email. I heard about you. I was on your website. I went and met with two of their leaders, Anna and Maya. It was a very rainy day like today as we were recording. I went and met them at Emory. I couldn't find parking. It was a thunderstorm that came out of nowhere. I was dripping wet, but I said, don't leave. I'm going to get there. I want to come have coffee with you. We sat down and we had coffee person to person. It was such a great conversation that they said, we need for the other people in our group to meet and to get some of this information. So I sat down with those 13 people with my colleague, and we had conversation. We had a workshop and a training, and they felt so commissionally convicted, as I'm bringing that back, that they went to the PSC and gave their comment. And again, we've talked about how this is rippled out through the news online. And when that story gets told, our name, GIPL, was a part of that story, and it builds trust in the community. It built trust with Ava and Maya and those other 11 students, so that when they talk to their friends, they talk about GIPL, and they're the trusted messenger. That's how this happens. To the extent that you're still listening on 1.5 speed, I'm so happy that you're getting to be a part of this conversation. Even though Anna and I can't hear you right now, I want you to know, and I do believe this, you are a part of this conversation, and the things that you're hearing that are striking you right now or making your palms a little itchy or like, I knew it, take action. Contact me, email the pod. Like, we want you to be a part of this conversation. We know you're a part of this conversation. And I think there's not a better use of my time today than talking to these folks.
I wanted to hit one more point with this sort of intersection of faith and environment. Even if people aren't embracing that they should be stewards of the earth, or, you know, they still, for whatever reason, don't believe that this is important, why is it still important to get that message out there? And maybe can you still change their minds? Or what do you do to people who don't want to listen?
Yeah, such a great question. And you talked about intersections. There's this tool that I use when I'm training folks in relationship with them. For your viewers that are just listening, they'll have to use their minds a little bit. But if you can imagine a Venn diagram or 3 circles, there's this intersection in the middle. And of those 3 circles, the community that I'm called to are folks that value scripture, science, and social action. So there are lots of folks that value scripture, don't care about science, don't care about taking social action. There are a lot of folks, maybe some folks listening right now, that care about the science of the climate crisis and want to take social action, but because they don't speak the language of scripture, they'll never get those bucket of folks. And then there are folks that are looking to agitate and be on the streets and carry the signs. They want to take the social action. They want to make the public commentary, but they don't know the science and they don't speak the scripture language. And so what they get written off as policymakers are just rabble rousers and tree huggers. And to be clear, we need everyone in this ecosystem. We need folks in the streets marching with signs. You are a valuable person. I have signs all the time. I'm always out there. So don't get this twisted. We need those folks. But the work that GIPL does at the intersection, and for those folks that can speak scripture values and trust the science and are ready to take collective social action together, that intersection, those folks are really powerful messengers to their faith communities and to policymakers. And that becomes really, really critical in the work that we do.
That's awesome. So I guess just looking ahead, what are GIPL's goals for the next 5 years and how do you plan going about achieve them? Obviously, the power is a big thing, but what else?
Yeah, I would say over the next 5 years, we want to continue to inspire and equip people of faith across Georgia to take action. And there are a couple of dates that are important in that 5-year window. We talked about the Public Service Commission elections, 25, 26, 28. Those are happening. The IRP, that's every 3 years. Every 4 years, legislators here in Georgia, local state reps and state senators are elected. Every 4 to 2 years, our congressmen and our senators get rotated out. Those elections are up. Your church, every Sunday, your masjid or your synagogue every Friday or Saturday is turning on light switches. Powering our communities is important. You know, our conversation today has kind of been at the group and collective level. We could talk about personal actions or household actions that people could take that are similar to some of the programs we've talked about. Those are critical matters. But what I would say when we talk about the 5-year vision of GIPL is that we have told the story well over the next 5 years. And we've lifted up people in the community to tell the story of why they're doing what they do. If we lift up those storytellers about the practical climate actions they've taken and why they've taken them, well, that's that multiplication funnel. Listen, learn, and go out there. That becomes critical.
That's awesome. So, and then reflecting on your journey with GIPL, what's been the most rewarding aspect?
I had a mentor tell me once that influence is what happens when you're in the room. Impact is what happens when you leave the room. It's really cool how influential GIPL is. Doing workshops, helping folks see what's what and how they can do things. But the impact of the work is when GIPL is not there. Have we equipped people, inspired them such that they're taking action without us? And so I know I keep going back to these students, but those were not GIPL volunteers. Those were not people wearing a GIPL sweatshirt like I'm wearing right now. Those were students that told an impactful story. Influence was what happened when I was in the workshop room with them. Impact was each of them standing at that podium. That's incredible. But I'll leave you with one more because it's really important. There can be no success without succession. There can be no success without succession. What does that mean? I've been in this role as organizing director for about 15 months now. It's been a fabulous year and a half. I've loved the work that I'm doing. But I don't measure my success in how many programs or podcasts or projects that I do, but it's in the amount of leaders that I bring up behind me. And I get it. I'm an organizing person. Of course he's going to say that, but it's true. If my success, if GIPL's success is just measured in the things that we do, that's not very successful to us. It's about raising up leaders. And again, it's why it's in our mission, inspire and equipping communities of faith. If we're not giving folks the resources to do what we do better in their own context, we're not raising up leaders. We're just collecting followers. And in a culture and a context that tells us to get more and more followers, how more radical and revolutionary can you be than to say, I don't want followers. I want to equip leaders, and I want to give away as much as I possibly can, as quickly as I possibly can, as successfully as I possibly can to these other folks.
And you've mentioned this, but how can people get involved with GIPL?
GIPL.org, GIPL.org. You can take action. You can kick the tires on our website. It is truly on our website, on social media, whether that's Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, seeing what we do first and just seeing if it connects with you. Just listen first. I would say that's the first step. Listen. If you then want to learn, connect with us online or email me. I'd love to sit down and have coffee, jump on a Zoom, and hear from you what's important to you. What actions have you already taken? What actions do you want to take? And then after listening and learning from one another, we can talk about what it looks like for you to lead in your context. That's really the steps and sequence. It's a journey. We're in relationship with folks for seasons, for months, not days and hours. We really count our relationship seasonally, not in the short term. But yeah, there are some tools on the shelf you can use right away if that's what you're interested in. But we're more interested in relationship over the long term. I would say that's the call to action. Be in relationship with us. I hope to hear from some of your folks. If you found me through the podcast, just in your email and your text, hey, I found you through Anna's podcast. I want to talk more. That's great because I think it goes to demonstrate how much your voice and how important this platform that you have is. And it's important that folks know how important your platform is.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for the time.
And you've said so many wonderful things over the course of this podcast episode. But is there anything else you would like to add that you don't think that we touched on that you think is important for the listeners to hear?
Yeah. Rest. Rest is the resistance. I think a rest mindset, whether it's sacred Sabbath rest or sabbaticals, we are human beings, Anna, not human doings. And part of the climate crisis that we find ourselves in is so intimately wrapped up in material needs and scarcity. In rest, especially if you want to enter this fight, be a part of this community that I'm calling people into, you need rest. You need daily rest. You need weekly rest. You need monthly rest. You need seasonal rest. Every so often, so many years, you need to take rest. And rest doesn't mean you're weak. Rest means you're strong. That's what I would say to your audience, that when I feel like I can't stop to rest because the work will stop, that probably means I haven't trained leaders, I've trained followers. It probably means I have too high an estimation of myself and my work. And it probably means that I've centered myself, not the work in others. I know I'm healthy when I can rest for a day or a month because there are other people in the fight. And in fact, I need to rest so I don't burn out. And in fact, rest reminds me that I'm tied in to creation, not above creation. And I actually think in the faith tradition that I'm a part of and others that are adjacent to my faith tradition share this foundational creation story that on the seventh day, God rested, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. and that ruling and reigning looks like rest, and that humanity was called into rest on the seventh day, is a really important story to remember in our current context. So that's what I would tell people that we didn't talk about. Rest is resistance.
I'd like to thank Marqus for taking the time to be interviewed. Now, if you're listening before June 8th, 2025, I highly recommend you check out GIPL's in-person Power Hours in Columbus, Georgia. This event is centered around the upcoming elections with the Public Service Commission, which was heavily covered in Part 1. If you would like to connect with GIPL, their information will be in the description. If you're on Spotify or YouTube, go ahead and drop a comment about what you found most enlightening about this conversation. If you're on Apple or Spotify, go ahead and rate this show 5 stars, as it really helps me out. And I will see all of you in the next episode.